Crawlspace. I'm Tim, here today alone in the Crawlspace studios, but don't worry, Lance will be back soon, and he does join us on a new show called Beyond Strange World that you may have noticed dropped in your feed. We hoped you liked it. It's just episode 1. We are doing at least 8, because there are 8 Travel Channel episodes of the show called Strange World, and our new podcast is called Beyond Strange World. It's a bit of a departure for us from heavy true crime stuff, and we have the host of the show, the star of the Travel Channel show, Christopher Garitano, on with us to break down each episode and to just get deeper into each topic, because some of them need more unpacking. But it's a lot of fun. It's conspiracy theories. There's one about James Dean's haunted car. It's interesting stuff, and we get to kind of push our limits of what we can believe, and I think that's what the show's all about. So join us on this ride if you are into that kind of thing. We do think it's a lot of fun. This episode today is with a mom. Her name is Connie Land. We met her at CrimeCon 2019. She came up to us. She gave us this document that she had written, and it's about her murdered daughter, Sydney Land. Sydney Land and Neo Kaufman were 21 when they were murdered in October of 2016 in Las Vegas. And we have Connie Land here to join us today. It's a sad case, and there seems to be some pretty good persons of interests in this case, as you'll hear from Connie, and you'll hear from Doug Poppa also, who's written a bunch of articles on this case for the Baltimore Post-Examiner. There are links in the show notes. And before we play the audio, I need to tell you about our upcoming live show with True Crime Obsessed. It's at the Bell House in Brooklyn, October 5th. That's a Saturday, October 5th, 2019. It is going to be a lot of fun. There are links in the show notes. Also, we're planning another event for the Mid-Atlantic region this fall in November, and there will be much more on this week and next week, and it's going to be a lot of fun. We really hope you can join us, and I'm not going to announce all of it yet. We're going to wait for next week, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Clear your calendar, early November, Mid-Atlantic range. Crawlspace-a-palooza, not the official title. Check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/crawlspacepodcast. Last week, I had Jordan Bonaparte of the Nighttime Podcast on with me, and we got pretty goofy. This week, we've got Captain from True Crime Garage, who's going to do a Patreon with me. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to quiz him on all sorts of weird stuff. And if you're following on social media, you may have seen that the new show from Crawlspace Media called Incel was just written up by the New York Times. So big congrats to Naama Cates, who is producing that show and hosting it, and it's a wonderful show. There have been 2 episodes that have been released so far, so you want to subscribe to that. And check out Crawlspace's full archive at Stitcher Premium, stitcherpremium.com. Use code MMM. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope you enjoy this interview with Connie Land and with Doug Poppa. Okay, we are being joined by Connie Land. Connie, how are you today?
Fine, Tim. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I'm sad to say that your daughter Sydney was killed in October of 2016, and your daughter Sydney Land, she was 21 at the time. I'm so sorry. And we met you. We met you at CrimeCon in 2019. You came right up to us with so much energy and passion, and you had a document that you had written, which is sort of your story of how you found out and as much of the investigation as you can kind of muster up, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive.
Thank you. You know, the reason why I wrote the article was it was a letter because, Tim, so many people say, I don't know how you could do this. I could never imagine being in your shoes. I don't know what I would do if I was in your shoes. I mean, it's always those comments we hear all the time. And I thought, you know, I invited people into my most sacred, most tender, and most hurtful place when I wrote that story. And it wasn't a story, it was just a recounting of the events, because I wanted people to understand and be even somewhat grasp that place of being, it's like the pendulum. The emotion and the sadness and the anguish and everything that we felt on that side, and then dealing with the loss of our daughter, and then turning around and having to deal with the frustrations of how this case has gone. The pendulum has swung both ways. And I wanted people to just step into my space for a moment. That's why I did that. That's why I wrote that story.
Yeah, it's definitely very powerful. Is this published online anywhere?
Yeah, it's published on the Baltimore Post-Examiner.com.
Okay.
It's a phenomenal online news publication. And although it's Baltimore, the journalist, he's an investigative journalist, Doug Poppa, is a longtime resident of Las Vegas. And he picked up this story and learned about the story. And so he is the one that has written the most accurate articles and information about this story. And so I felt like once I met Doug and we had established a relationship in what we were doing in our efforts, I knew that he was factual and truthful in the information in the information he was writing in his articles. And I felt like that was a great platform for me to write that story because I could express it the way it needed to be expressed without being edited and tampered with. And they were phenomenal in doing that.
Great. Yeah, I've definitely seen Doug Poppa's work on the Baltimore Post-Examiner just in, research on this case. And he's written a lot of articles on it. And so you didn't know him beforehand?
I didn't know him. When I met Doug, he reached out at 11:30 at night. I got a call and said, "Hey, I want you to know I'm running a story on your daughter." And I had one or two articles, like if you search Connie Land, Google, I saw one or two articles about the Baltimore Post-Examiner. And my initial thought was, why would someone in Baltimore be writing a story about a double homicide in Las Vegas? Mm-hmm. And then when he reached out, the first article that was written was actually involving Judge Tobiasen. And when I read his article, I was like, oh my gosh, everything that he was writing in that article was communication and information, a lot of information that I knew in my dealings with Judge Melanie Andrus Tobiasen. She's a current judge. And once I knew that, I knew that he knew exactly what he was talking about. I knew the information that he had written in that first article was correct. And so I followed back up to him and I said, listen, this is what you know, but you don't know what I know. And that's how we started collaborating in putting the pieces together of this puzzle, because I knew what he wrote had been the truth.
Wow, that's great. And so I imagine you guys made a good team like that. And Doug is here with you.
Doug is actually here.
So, I saw that you wrote a lot about the case, and but it was a little confusing at first because you wrote for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, but this story is so Las Vegas centric. But I understand you're from Las Vegas. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I've been in Vegas for 25 years. I'm a former police officer back east. I've been out here 25 years. I was director of security, 2 different properties, investigator for Jim Graham when I first got here in the 90s, and now retired on Social Security, writing part-time for the Baltimore Post-Examiner.
And when you teamed up with Connie to discuss Sydney's case, what insight did she give you that you hadn't found yet?
Well, she had insight as far as the communication she had with the detectives and what she knew about her daughter's death and her daughter's friends, stuff that I didn't know. My involvement came into this before I met Connie. Last year, in the spring of 2018, I had done a recorded telephonic interview on the record with Las Vegas Township Judge Melanie Andrus Tobiasen. Because that story, when she was telling me, really, I had no idea what was going on with the murder. It was focused on her giving information about police corruption in the vice unit of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to an FBI special agent. That's how I got involved with her. And during her talking to me in the interview, she told me she was speaking to an agent named Kevin White and was giving this information about underage prostitution and corruption within the vice unit of the LVMPD. That was the gist of why I was talking to the judge, and that was the interest in my case. And I didn't know anything about the Land Nehemiah Kaufman murders, okay? I didn't hear about it. So she mentioned that, but it was just going in one ear and out the other. later on, when I started doing more investigation, that's when I wrote the story, because she told me, and I put this in a couple of stories, that the reason why Sidney Land and Neil Kaufman were murdered, and she told me this on the record in a recording, is that it was supposed to be her and her daughter who were meant to be killed. And it all happened because 8 hours prior to the murder on October 26th, okay, allegedly happened at 12:30 in the morning on the 26th. She said 8 hours prior, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, her and her daughter were outed by vice detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The judge told me that because of that meeting, that they outed her and her daughter. They told this cop, this Metro cop, the two vice detectives said that we got this information from Judge Tobiasen and basically from her daughter. So they outed her, and she told me that the murders were a direct result of what happened in that meeting about 8 hours before the murder. Now, when I published the story, Judge Tobiasen stopped contacting me. She was upset that I published, even though she knew the story was going to be published. And I never got a chance to re-interview her to find out what was the link she was talking about, why the murders happened, because she said the wrong two people got murdered. And she says that on the recording. It was supposed to be me and my daughter, but it ended up being Sidney Land and Neil Kaufman, because it was a direct result of that meeting when the vice detectives outed me and my daughter. This is all recording on the record. It's in the story that I wrote. So what we have here right now, which is very important to me, is we have a sitting Las Vegas Township judge. She's still on the bench, okay, telling an investigative journalist on the record in 2018 that the Sidney Land, Neil Kaufman murders occurred because it was supposed to be her and her daughter who was supposed to be killed and not them. And it was a direct result of her and her daughter being outed by vice detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. What I do not know at this date is the link between that meeting and why that ended up with Sidney and Neil Kaufman, Sidney Land and Neil Kaufman being murdered.
Okay, and the last article you had written on this was in July 2nd of 2019, I believe. Was that the last one?
Yeah, the last story I concerning this and the judge was around July. I think it was just the beginning of July of this month.
And it's very comprehensive. You even get former New York police detective Frank Serpico to weigh in, which is kind of cool. So I guess I have a little bit of a general question for you. You're a U.S. Army veteran and a police veteran. Why are you so focused on the corruption end? I assume it has something to do with your career.
Yes, I grew up in New York City, real short, brief bio here. I grew up in New York City. I spent about 2 years on the New York City Auxiliary Police Force, went in the Army and was a military policeman for 3 years, got honorable discharge, got out. I was a police officer in the town of Herndon, Virginia for a year, and then I switched over to the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office in 1980, was there approximately almost 12 years. Got promoted to the rank of detective, what they called back then criminal investigator. 1986, I did many years undercover. I was criminal investigator of the year. I had, commendations and stuff. So, I write these stories. Frank Serpico is a friend of mine.
Yeah.
I wrote a 12-page, 12-chapter story on it. So about 2-3 weeks before the murders that happened on October 26th of 2016, one of the persons of interest, his name is Shane Valentine, he's in prison right now. He tried to kill Neil Kaufman and threatened to kill his girlfriend, Sydney, and another girl, this Frankie Zappia. So much so that on the morning of October 8th of 2016, Shane Valentine went over to Neil Kaufman's mother's house and fired a round or two into the house. At the same time, he was on the phone with Neo, and we have those text messages where he was threatening to kill him and he was going to go after his girlfriend and his mother.
And so that's what he's in jail for now, Shane?
Well, he's in jail for now for some burglary charges, and he's in jail for shooting into the occupied dwelling, which after documents I just got the past couple of days I'm working on for another story, I believe they should have charged him with attempted murder tonight. There were 5 people in that house. He knew he was shooting at the house because he wanted to kill Neo per the text messages.
Yeah.
And he was only charged with shooting into an occupied dwelling. So that'll be another story that'll be coming out hopefully in the next couple of days.
Okay, great. And does this Judge Tobiasen, does she preside over any of the districts or any, like Shane's case or anything like that?
In her recorded interview with me, she was presiding over in 2015 some cases with Shane Valentine. She later told me that she ended up excusing herself. Also, what came out, just so you know, so I get on the record, is she told me that she had threatened Shane Valentine through his attorney at the time. She had called up the attorney, said, "You better stay away from my daughter," because her daughter also had an involvement with Shane Valentine. I know this is very convoluted, but This is all true. It sounds crazy. Later on, she told me that she actually went over to his house, and I put that in the story, and she kicked in the door to Shane Valentine's residence. Okay? So we got this involvement with this judge whose daughter had an involvement not only with Shane Valentine, one of the persons of interest in the murders, but also with Neo Kaufman, one of the deceased, with the double homicide with Connie Land. And so it's a very convoluted case. It's very troubling because, you have a judge, you have this alleged police corruption, you got a judge being outed. The judge says the reason why the murders happened was because it was supposed to be me and my daughter, and it was all because of that meeting that happened 8 hours prior with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department vice detectives when they outed her and her daughter as being a source of information to another Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officer and his daughter, who was an alleged prostitute for Shane Valentine, who is now allegedly working for Neo Kaufman. Very convoluted, but when you separate everything, it's not really that convoluted as it is. So that's where we stand at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for chatting with us for a few minutes here. I appreciate it. We will definitely be checking out your future articles, and I'll link to your other ones in the show notes.
Okay, I'm going to put Connie back on.
Very cool. So do you get to see Doug often, or when you guys are working together?
No, you know what? I've seen Doug a handful of times. A lot of our communication is, through phone conversation or just sharing information via email or different things like that. But he lives close.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Yeah, I was wondering because the Baltimore connection made it a little confusing, or the Baltimore Post-Examiner for a second there. But okay, so I just want to take it back a little bit here. And what was your daughter Sydney like?
Sydney was one of the most loving people you'll ever meet. She was very giving. She didn't have a judgmental bone in her body. She was friends with anyone and everyone. She was a very loyal person. She was a little quiet until you got to know her. And she was just kind of this fun, giggly, girl. And she loved her family. She really loved us. And she was very close to Preston, my son. But she loved each of the kids in an individual way. And I think the best way that I can describe Sydney, we had done a personal development class, her and I had done it together. And one day we came home and Sydney had put post-it notes all around the frame of the boys' desks in their room and Kendall's, me or my youngest daughter. And on each of the notes she personalized each message. And on one she would put, "You are loving. You are the best brother. You are kind. You are smart." And she wrote personal comments or personal compliments to each of the kids. And when the kids came home, they walked into their room and all of those notes were all over their rooms. And that's how Sydney was. She was just amazing, really amazing.
It's very sweet.
Yeah, she was a very, very, she's like your 3 o'clock friend. Like if you broke down, when people go, "What kind of friend is this?" Are they like, if you get a flat tire at 3 a.m, is this the person you could call? Sydney was absolutely the person that you could call. She would be there for you in a minute.
Right. Wow. Yeah. You could call me at 3 p.m., but probably not 3 a.m.
Exactly. But Sydney was the 3 a.m. She was that type of person.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how many siblings did she have?
She has 3 others. She has 2 brothers and 1 sister. So Sydney was the oldest, and then Preston, Gavin, and Kendall.
I'm so
And
sorry.
they're 2 years apart, give or take a few months. Yeah.
And what was this like for them?
You know, Preston was, they each had a unique relationship. Kendall was, the sister. So even though there was almost 6 years difference between the two, that was her younger sister. She loved Gavin, and she was very protective of Gavin and held a really special place. Gavin had a really special place in Sid's heart. And Preston was Sydney's best friend. They would just giggle and did dumb things together, and that's just what they did. And so what this has been for them has been a nightmare, a complete nightmare. And there's always firsts. There's always firsts. Kendall just graduated from high school, and everybody's like, she should be here, and she should have been. So there's always events that take place in our life that reopen a wound of reminding us how she should be there. And so it's just something we'll never fully heal. There's never a fully healing of this.
Right.
You don't ever get over it. And it's things you never think of. Preston turned 22 this year. He was now older than Sydney. Sydney died when she was 21. And so that was a very difficult birthday. His 21st birthday was so tough. 22nd was very tough because Sydney was 21 when she died, and now Preston's older than Sydney in being around. And that, you wouldn't think about that, but you do.
What do they think of your pursuit for justice or exposure in this case?
I'm very vocal. I am very relentless in doing this, clearly, to go to CrimeCon with only the intention of handing out this information to get this story out to different people because of the difficulties in exposure to this case. And I think it's painful for the kids. They don't really talk about Sydney a whole lot. I think it hurts them. And I try to keep balance because it would be very easy to become, unbalanced in moving forward on this. So I have to make sure and put this on the shelf for a while. And my kids are still here. I still have a family here. And in keeping my, checks and balances in place, Sydney would not want me to obsess on something like this. And I can't. I own a business. I have 3 kids. I have a husband and a family and a life. And so we just take it in stride.
Yeah, well, that's good. And I saw your email address is Just Because Gifts. Is that's your own business?
Yeah, so I am Just Because Gifts and 702 Promos. So it's a custom gift company and a promotional or branded marketing company here in Las Vegas. So I've done that. 702 Promos has been about 13 years, and Just Because Gifts has been 25 years. It's been a long time.
Wow, that's very cool. And so you've been in Las Vegas for a long time. Were you born there too?
No, I was actually born in Whittier, so outside of Los Angeles. I grew up in Southern California. Yeah. So I grew up in Southern California, and my dad retired from the LAPD, and we moved away. And then I went to college and out of state, moved back to California, and then moved back home with my parents. And that's where I met Steve. And then we moved back to California, and they ended up in Las Vegas. So we've been here since 94.
Your father was a former LAPD officer. Is he still around?
He's still around.
Wow. What does he think?
Yeah. My dad was the epitome of what a great police officer should be. And so this has been very difficult to see the inconsistencies in the case, to see how the police have handled this case, to see he's like, Connie, I mean, this is not how we did police work back in the day. And I know that how certain things have happened along the way in this case is not the norm. And so he's like, Con, there's good guys that are on here. The truth is going to come out. The truth is going to come out. Just keep doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Truth will come out.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we do. I don't hinge my efforts on the results because there are so many variables in this case and so many people that are involved in the final outcome and the results of this case. So very early on, I gauged my success strictly by my efforts. And so, for example, when I went to CrimeCon, I knew I needed to get this story out to every single person that I possibly could. And that's what I did. I wasn't going to be disappointed. I would be disappointed if I didn't get any calls back, but I knew that my efforts, I was responsible for my efforts, and that was getting there and giving 100%. And so, and how that efforts were perceived or followed up on by, the people that I handed the information out to, I couldn't be responsible for that.
Right.
And that's how I've geared, how I've kept myself accountable in this process.
And how many of these pamphlets, documents did you hand out?
I brought, I think I had 71. Wow. And I knew I had to hand out 71, and I think I handed out 70. I found 2 in my bag. So I did exactly what I needed to. People are like, did you go out? Did you go to no, I was there to work.
Yeah.
I was there for Sydney and for no other reason but that. So that was my effort. That was the focal point of being there.
Well done. Well, yeah, I hope you get a bunch of other calls as well. From our perspective, I think we couldn't possibly ignore you or this case after meeting you and being handed this emotional document. Yeah. Did your kids or your husband read this document as well?
I think my husband, I gave it to him to read, and he's been through it. I discussed it with the kids, and whether they read it or not, I've kind of left it up to them to reading articles and how they process this information. I'm not going to shove something on them that they're not comfortable with. Yeah. I knew this was something I needed to do for me, because part of writing that was very healing for me. And writing about my emotion with Sydney was much easier to write than the frustrations of the case, because those feelings with Sydney and finding her and seeing her for the first time, those are very sacred, personal emotions and thoughts that I had, and they were very private with my daughter. And so that was easier for me to write about, because it was a calm, it was more of a sacred reverence of emotion, where dealing with the frustrations and the anger of the things that we've dealt with in the case, that fills me with rage and anger. And then I get mad, and then I'm all over. And so those emotions are much harder for me to corral than those emotions with Sydney, because there's a lot more in play with those. So it was harder for me to write the parts about the case than it was about Sydney.
I could see that.
Because I was very clear on my thought. Yeah, I was very clear on my thoughts with Sydney. Those were very private moments, and those are easier to decipher. Painful, but easier to decipher.
I'm curious what it would have been like for you if you hadn't written this.
In working in this case and doing what I'm doing, in getting this out to the public and trying to hold the police accountable on all the different things, creating awareness to this has been very therapeutic for me and a huge sense of healing for me. My personality, I'm not the type to sit back and do nothing. That's just not in my DNA in any way, shape, or form. And Sydney would expect this from me. I mean, everything that I'm doing, if Sydney was here and say, what would you expect from my mom? She would say I would expect her to do exactly what she's doing. And so for that, I feel like my responsibilities as a mother did not end when Sydney died. My responsibility as a mother continues as long as I need to provide protection, awareness, whatever it is. Because Sydney's not here doesn't mean that I just wash my hands and walk away. Absolutely not. She needs us as much now as she did when she was here. And so that's the opportunity that I get to do as her mother in providing, in doing this.
If you don't mind me asking, how much did it cost you to print these documents out and get to CrimeCon and everything?
I've spent a lot of money. And so for doing the documents, I have a great printer, but I mean, I was into thousands to get to CrimeCon and the hotel and all the different things. But then we've also run billboards. And the billboards we've run, we did one set that was $5,000 for 3 months. You're about $4,500. And I did those for 3 months. So, I'm at $13,500 on that. And then we've run the billboards for Sydney 2 other times at $2,500 a month. And we did them for a few months. So I'm well over $20,000 that we've personally we've had a few donations through GoFundMe or Facebook, but we've paid for those, and not including the time. I mean, I can't put a monetary value on the time researching and phone calls and emails. So, but it doesn't matter, So yeah, we've spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it's been required. So it's been a challenge financially, but it was one that was absolutely necessary to keep this story out there.
I'm curious, did you personally know Neo Kaufman, who was also a victim in this case?
So I had met Neo. Actually, the very first time that I met Neo was at the dentist office when we were getting our teeth cleaned, and it was an incident that I had discussed in the story. And Sydney brought him in, and I'm like, "Hey, nice to meet you." And he was very quiet. We briefly chatted, and then I went in, and then we left. And then I saw Neo again, and he came to the home, came to our house. And so I spoke to him very briefly. Steve wasn't home. And we talked. He was very pleasant, very quiet, and very, very pleasant. But those were the only times that I had met him. And I thought he was a nice guy.
Yeah.
It wasn't until after I started hearing things and unfortunately, warning signs started going off while Sydney was alive. But a lot of the things that I learned was after they passed.
Yeah. So when they were killed, they were in their apartment together?
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about the circumstances?
Yeah. So Sydney, I think people are under the impression that Sydney and Neo had been together for a really long time. They hadn't. They had been together a couple months at best. And my understanding is August, right around in August is when they met. So this was not like a long-standing, long relationship. And Sydney got the apartment in her name only in September. And so they hadn't been in that apartment a long time before they were killed. My understanding, and based on the information that I have been told, was Sydney was not supposed to be in the apartment that night. Per Frankie and her communication with me, she had said that we tried to get her out of the apartment. She wasn't supposed to be home. The intention that night was, based on Frankie, was they were all supposed to go to Dre's that night. Neo was not, because he wasn't 21, but they were supposed to go up. And then Sydney had actually booked a hotel room at the Link that night at 11:48 p.m. on October 25th. In her notes in her Gmail account, the confirmation number, she had written the confirmation number in. So the intention was to go to Dre's and then go to the Link Hotel on the Strip, hang out for a couple days with all their friends. And I think the checkout day was the 28th. And interestingly enough, no one showed up at the hotel. No one called Sydney. No one texted her. No one Snapchatted her. No one did an Instagram or a private message to her to wonder. So I thought it was odd that, their friends, they're all supposed to hang out and meet. Sydney doesn't show up. And Frankie was the last one to see him alive. She had been at the apartment that night. And it's my understanding that Frankie was supposed to give Sydney and Nehemiah a ride that night. And the police told me that she was the last, our detectives told us that Frankie was the last person to see Sydney alive, and that's how we know that. So I find it very odd that no one knew. But the circumstances of the night, Sydney was, they were in the apartment, Nehemiah and Sydney. We know that this was not a forced entry. We know that Neo was shot for the police in the living room. Sydney was in the bedroom, and she was shot there.
Okay, and was Shane known to be an enemy of Neo at that point?
So Shane and Nehemiah, I guess, knew each other. And again, I didn't know about this until after. And a lot of the things that I've learned have been through news articles and different publications and in speaking to the police. But the shooting on October 8th is critical because in the text messages on October 8th, there was a falling out and between Nehemiah and Shane Valentine. What I've been told is that Shane was looking for Nehemiah. There was a couple phone calls. Shane called Sydney's cell phone looking for Nehemiah. Frankie answered Sydney's phone, pretending like she was Shane. And I guess that there was some disrespecting going on between the communication. They went to Red Rock Casino, Shane, Frankie, Sydney, and Nehemiah, and there was an altercation and some arguing there. It was a few hours later, Shane went over to Nehemiah Kaufman's mother's home or family home and called Neo out, said he was going to kill him. He was a dead man, shot into the house, threw one or two rocks through the window, and ran his car into the closed garage door. And that's what elevated. And in text messages that the police said that there were text messages between Nehemiah and Shane, that Shane was going to kill Nehemiah and his girlfriend, and I've heard Frankie. And so from that, the death threats continued until the night of the murders. They were both executed, and Sydney was shot in the face, and Nia was shot in the head also. And they had mentioned that Shane was around the apartment around the time of the murder. He turned his phone off. As he went to California, he turned his phone back on in Baker immediately after the murders, and he was picked up in Los Angeles a few days later.
Okay, so he sort of crossed state lines pretty soon
He
after?
crossed state lines.
And that was like a couple days after the murders?
A couple days after the murder, the police detectives went down. Shane was picked up, and they extradited him back to Las Vegas.
Okay, good. And do you have any idea what their spat was about originally?
You know, I know that the detective Nia was involved in. There was some gang affiliation. They have mentioned that Nia was getting into pimping. We know that he was doing home invasions with Shane Valentine. And so there were multiple things that Nia was involved in. Shane is also a pimp. And he has been arrested for countless home invasions and burglaries. And so the probability could have been over a girl and pimping and prostitution and human trafficking. That could be a possibility. Could it be over a gun? We've heard it was over a gun. We've heard it was over home invasions. And so we don't know why, but there's a lot of different probabilities. And we know that, Neil was entwined with Shane in a few different variables, both in pimping and in, both being pimps, and both they did home invasions together.
Were there any witnesses to the crime, or anyone hear any sounds?
Really interesting that you say that. Because I had an opportunity. It was a fluke thing. I went into the apartment with Nehemiah's mother in February of 2017, and it just happened the apartment door was open, and we were able to go into the apartment. It was about 5:30 at night, Sydney Neo's apartment, and I had never been in there. And Tim, it was crazy because I could hear the downstairs. They lived upstairs. Downstairs, I could hear the baby crying downstairs. I could hear their phone ring. I could hear their TV on. So I find it completely odd that no one called in 2 shootings. That would have been heard. I know the police had made mention sometime after that there was an officer, I believe, from Michigan, and his wife. He's retired. They lived in the direct site of the apartment complex, upstairs, downstairs. I'm not sure, and they didn't come forward. It was the police that tracked them down. And what the detective told me, and again, I don't know if it's the truth or not, but this is what the detectives had said, so I'm just going to assume that the information is accurate. He said, Connie, they were night owls. He said the wife was sitting on the couch. All she had to do was move the blinds, and she would have seen who was at the door. What she said was she heard pounding on the door. She heard arguing. She heard one gunshot, a second gunshot, and scuffling. She went into her husband, who was in the bedroom, and said, did that sound like gunshots? He said, yes, and they went to bed. He said, Connie, had they called 911, would have completely changed the outcome potentially changed the outcome of how this case was. All she had to do was move the blinds, and she would have seen who it was. But they never called. And I find it crazy that no one called in to gunshots at night. And I actually pulled the 911 calls or the response calls to that address just to see. And, per the records, and I don't know if records can be manipulated, but there were no 911 calls about potential gunshots heard that night.
And what about Frankie Zappia? She was a friend of Sydney's?
Yeah. Sydney has known Frankie since junior high. They went to junior high, so they've been friends since junior high. And Frankie was, overweight. She was really a simple girl in high school. And, Sydney went away to school. I don't know what Frankie did. And I don't know when they reconnected, at what point. I'm not sure. I don't know if they were in continual communication. I know that one of Frankie's relatives told me that Sydney was at the house when they learned that Frankie was a prostitute. I guess a card came up that she had a warrant for arrest or needed to appear in court. And she said Sydney was so mad that they knew that Frankie was a prostitute because their understanding was Frankie was working at Cane's and working at Hurley or something like that. And Sydney had severed communication with Frankie. I know in the summer of 2016, Sydney was not in communication with Frankie. And I know this through messages on her phone or in her social media that she was not in communication because Frankie was trying to get in touch with Sydney and they hadn't been in communication. So Frankie was in jail in the summer of 2016. And I had reached out to a friend of theirs and wanted Sydney to reach out to her. So their friendship reconnected in, I would imagine, July, August, when Frankie was in jail. And Frankie was a prostitute. And my understanding, she has been a prostitute for Shane at one point and was a prostitute for Dominic Thompson.
Okay. And have you been in touch with Frankie?
We didn't know any of this was going on. And unfortunately, information that we were talking, I had talked to Frankie initially. And then when we started to see things were not adding up, I severed ties with Frankie. And it was her sister that had reached out in end of November, 1st of December of 2016. Her sister had reached out to me and said that she believed that Frankie and her pimp Damo were somehow involved in the homicide. Didn't say they shot him, didn't say anything of that, but that they were somehow involved and that she was going to go to homicide and tell them the information she had heard on the phone in Frankie's communication with her mother the night of the homicide. So, once I learned those things, I severed communication with Frankie because I knew at that point she hadn't been truthful.
Yeah.
Or was truthful but wasn't disclosing her real relationship with Sydney. And it's disappointing because as good of a friend that Sydney was to Frankie, it's devastating to think that Frankie would do this to Sydney.
Yeah.
Or know about it and not come forward. I know Sydney would have gone to the police. She would have.
Right. And so it seems like there's a little bit of a social media element to the investigation, whether it be with messages on, or the lack of messages, I should say, even between Sydney and Frankie and some of her other friends. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I had actually given, because I'm not very social media savvy and with Sydney's communication and the information that was going on, I had given access to my niece to help me, Frankie, Lauren Harvey. I'd actually given her Sydney's login to help me retrieve information and collect anything that I could on Sydney's social media. And interestingly enough, I don't know how this happened, but all the communication between Frankie, Lauren, and Sydney were deleted. And any phone calls or any photos were deleted. That was concerning.
Yeah, I would say so. Did the police get that stuff before it was deleted?
Tim, here's the thing. I don't think the police have really done a whole lot on this case. I provided that information to them in November, 1st of November. I gave them her passwords, passcodes, phone records, and Sydney was on our phone. That's why I know that, that there wasn't any communication. I know that Frankie had tried to communicate in the middle of the night of the murder, through text message. And so I do know that there was 5 text messages that Frankie tried to reach out to Sydney at 1:52 a.m. but I don't know, because Sydney's phone was damaged, I don't know what the content of those phone records are. I just know that Frankie tried to reach out to Sydney that morning, and that was the only messages that were done. As far as that's concerned, it's been difficult because the police didn't follow up on that information. It wasn't until October of this past year, so going on 2 years, I have had some independent people start doing some research and reaching out and looking into some things, and there were some major discrepancies. And I learned at that time they hadn't even bothered to look into Sydney's phone records, or the day the murders happened, they hadn't bothered to look into that. And I don't believe, and they asked me who Sydney's phone carrier was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they should have known who our phone carrier was. They'd had our phone records for 2 years.
Ugh.
And it wasn't until May of 2019, I had given them a name was given to us that was, and we know Nia was controlling Sydney's phone. And we know that because my daughter Kendall would call Sydney and Nia would answer. Or Sydney would say, it's just Kendall, please let me talk to her. And we know from her other friends that Nia was controlling Sydney's phone, who she could talk to. So there's a great possibility that Nia was using Sydney's phone in some outbound phone calls that were made the day of the murder, who were there was some unsavory people that were connected in that phone calls that were made that day, 2 outgoing calls. And the police didn't even bother to look into those names until May of this year when they said they did a search. So I don't think the police have done a whole lot on this case, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, that is a shame. How are you feeling about where everything is now? I mean, is there any positive news coming in your opinion?
There is. The police will not communicate with me at this point.
Uh-huh.
I'm in my last communication in May. And here's the thing: is call it a coincidence, call it not. We know that Detective Grimmett in my case was leaking information to Judge Tobiasen throughout the entire investigation. And I know while I was in communication with the judge, he was in communication with her. We know that Greg Flores is the godfather to Frankie Zappia and or lifelong friend. We know per Detective Dosh that Greg Flores is the one that issued the search warrant on Frankie's apartment. Now, why they would have a godfather or lifelong family friend involved in the homicide investigation where his goddaughter is a suspect or person of interest, I'm not quite sure. Why Detective Grimmett was leaking information to a judge who was directly linked in threatening the life of Shane Valentine and kicking in his door and her daughter. The police, there's just been nothing but inconsistencies in the autopsy, in the reports that were done, in dates, in times, in you name it. They've got Sydney in 3 different outfits in her autopsy report. They've got leaking of information, Grimmett going on national television on Crime Watch Daily saying that basically the DNA was a mess. There were cigarette butts, ashtrays, coffee cups. They don't know who was supposed to be there, who wasn't supposed to be there. And I know that per the judge, she told me that there was DNA evidence in the house. So basically, to me, the homicide detectives have ruined any possibility of DNA evidence being used, knowing that there is corruption and ties to DAs and pimps and prostitutes that may not be directly linked to this case per se, but because we know that element has existed in the FBI investigation, which was confirmed by Sheriff Lombardo, that is a very big concern, knowing pimps and prostitutes were involved in the FBI investigation. Pimps and prostitutes are involved in this case, and there have been statements made again by the judge, Melanie Tobiasen, that links Shane Valentine to Molly Mall, who is part of the FBI investigation. I mean, so is there cover-up? Quite possible. I knew that it was the police. I felt very early on that the police weren't going to do a whole lot to solve this case for whatever reason, and that this case wasn't going to move forward. And look, almost 3 years later, there's no person of interest, official persons of interest. There's no motives. There's no anything. There's absolutely nothing. And I find that very, very, very hard to believe. And so I knew in my efforts, and there has been no media coverage on this case, which is a major case, by the way.
Yeah.
When you're talking judges and DAs and vice corruption and cops and FBI investigations and all the things that are going on, It's crazy that the media has been dead silent in this case. Doug Poppa is the only one that's been writing about this story.
Yeah.
Because everybody else is, they'll talk about the billboards or different things that we've done. So we have done a lot of interviews, but nothing of real relevance as to the case. It's like we want people to come forward. We're doing the billboards, real very surface interviews, which I'm so grateful for because it's keeping the story out there. And so, that is great. But the real nuts and bolts of what's going on in this case have been written by Doug at the Baltimore Post-Examiner. I knew very early on the only way this case will be solved is by national exposure and pressure from podcasts, from news outlets that are not linked to people here. This is a very small town. Las Vegas is a very small town. And so that's why I knew I was going to have to go outside of this valley to have people start asking questions that they can't run and hide anymore. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just going outside of the valley for help. And you're one of them.
Well, great, Connie. I'm definitely happy to help, and hopefully this helps shake things up a little bit, and we'll definitely share this far and wide. And if you want me to try to introduce you to any other podcasters or any other people that we might know, I can certainly try get the story out even further.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. Anyone that you feel could help share the story, provide insight, anything that you can do, I am absolutely open to talk to. I need your help. You guys are, you are my partner in helping solve this case. And so I'm open to speaking to anybody. I'm open to discussing the case with anyone. And so, pass it along, share it with whoever. I'm grateful for it. What I would suggest is a concern that I also have is, as of a few weeks ago, about a month ago, I called Crime Stoppers, which is a national organization that people can call in. As of a month ago, there has not been not one phone call into Crime Stoppers about this case. And I find that numerically impossible, knowing that there's 3 million people in this valley. This has been on national television. This has been through all over the country, the exposure of this case, that there hasn't been one person that's called in. And per Detective Dosh, they had one phone call about this case of information that's come in. So whether that's truth or not, that's also a big concern, that they may not be taking information in. So my suggestion would be Doug Poppa. I can provide Doug Poppa's information, and I know that Doug will. Any information that has come in or would come in, we will share the information with the police department because we're all on the same page. We want this case solved. But I would prefer to have any information go to Doug's email or his cell phone number that I'll provide to you. And so for any leads, any information, anything that's needed, you can do that. And he's offered that, which is phenomenal. And I want to thank you, Tim. Honestly, I have mentioned this before, but I will mention it again. You are the voice of my daughter. You are the voice of my family. And you're reaching avenues that we couldn't reach if it wasn't for you. And you create a sense of hope for myself and for our family in moving this case forward. So what you do and our appreciation cannot be put into words. And just know how truly grateful I am for the opportunity, for you sharing this information, for talking to me at CrimeCon, and helping us move this forward in a way that justice will come for Sydney.